I still remember that evening as if it happened yesterday. The golden sunset was melting into the horizon, the city lights flickering to life. And my heart, restless, anxious, full of dreams, beat faster than usual. I had just received a text from Katie. "We need to talk, Andrew." At that moment, I thought she was nervous about the wedding. After all, we were only 3 weeks away from tying the knot. Everything felt perfect, or at least I thought it was. When I arrived at her place, she looked different. Not in the way she dressed or smiled, but in her eyes. There was distance, guilt. She couldn't even meet my gaze. "Andrew," she began softly, "I think we need to take a break." Those words hit me like a slow-moving blade, not sharp enough to kill, but deep enough to destroy something inside me. I tried to stay calm. "A break? Katie, what are you saying?" We've been planning everything together for months, but she wouldn't look at me. Instead, she said something that shattered me completely. "It's your father, Terrell." I think I'm in love with him." I froze. My breath left my body. For a few seconds, the world around me blurred into silence. My own heartbeat was the only sound I could hear. My father, the man who taught me everything about loyalty, discipline, and respect, the same man who once told me, "Never betray the people who trust you." I couldn't speak. My mind refused to process what I was hearing. Katie stood there trembling, as if she wanted me to forgive her, as if betrayal could ever be forgiven. I walked out without saying a word. The night air felt heavier than ever. Every step home felt like I was walking through mud, dragging pieces of my broken heart behind me. But the real nightmare hadn't even begun yet. When I reached home, my father was waiting in the living room, calm, composed, as if he had been expecting me. "Son," he said, adjusting his tie, "I think we need to talk about Katie." That's when I realized it wasn't just her. He knew he was part of it. "Dad," I said through clenched teeth, "please tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing." He sighed almost impatiently. "Andrew, she's an adult. So, and my feelings happen. You'll understand someday." Understand. He took my fiancée and expected me to understand. That night, something inside me broke for good. I wasn't just a betrayed son. I was a man stripped of trust, of pride, of everything he ever loved. And right then, I made myself a promise. If they wanted to break me, they would regret it. Because the moment my father chose her over me, he declared a silent war. The following days were unbearable. Every corner of my home reminded me of what I had lost or what had been stolen from me. Katie's laugh, once a melody I cherished, now echoed in my mind as a cruel mockery. Every message on my phone, every notification, felt like a trigger, reminding me that my world had shifted, and not by chance, but by choice. I tried to act normal at work, but even there, my focus kept slipping. Emma noticed it immediately. She was sharp, intuitive, the kind of coworker who could read the cracks in your armor without you saying a word. "Andrew," she said one afternoon, handing me a cup of coffee, "you've been off lately. What's going on?" I wanted to tell her everything, but I didn't. Some things are too shameful even to share. Not because they're mine alone, but because admitting them aloud makes the betrayal even more real. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile that felt hollow even to me. Emma didn't push. She never did. But later, as she walked back to her desk, I caught her eyes, the subtle flicker of concern that didn't leave me. I envied her strength, the way she could stay grounded while my world collapsed. And collapse it did. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I started replaying every memory with Katie and my father, searching for signs, clues, anything that could have hinted at this betrayal. Every laugh, every tender moment, every promise made in confidence, suddenly tainted. The hardest part was my father. I grew up believing he would always protect me. He was my guide, my mentor, my rock. But that man, the one who gave me life, had chosen someone else over me. Someone who had promised to love me, to stand by me, to build a life with me. I couldn't bear to face them together. The thought of seeing them side by side, smiling, acting as if nothing had happened, it made my stomach churn. My chest tightened with a pressure I couldn't release. And yet, a part of me, a very dark part, began to awaken. The part that refused to be broken. The part that demanded justice. I started observing them. Small things at first. Their patterns, their schedules. The way Katie would text him when I wasn't around. The way my father would smile at her, not like a father, but like a man who had chosen her. Every detail was a thread, and I began collecting them, storing them in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle that I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, until I realized that solving it might be the only way to survive. I felt isolated, trapped inside a world that made no sense. Friends tried to help, but no one could understand what it felt like to have your heart, your future, your trust, all handed over to someone else. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was existential. It made me question everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, family, and myself. And in the silence of my despair, I made a choice. I wouldn't let this define me. I wouldn't let them think they could hurt me and walk away untouched. There would be consequences. I didn't know yet how or when, but the fire had started burning quietly inside me, demanding action. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and started planning, not with rage, not with blind anger, but with careful calculation. Every lie, every deceit, every hidden truth became a tool I could use. The person I had been vulnerable, trusting, emotional, would no longer exist. What was rising from the ashes would be sharper, stronger, and unstoppable. Emma had no idea. I didn't tell her yet. She was still my anchor, but she didn't need to know the full storm that was brewing, and I didn't want anyone to interfere. This was mine to own, mine to control. I went to bed that night with a strange clarity. Betrayal had stripped me bare, but in that emptiness, I found purpose. A cold, precise purpose. They thought they had destroyed me, but all they had done was awaken something in me that could never be silenced, and that something was the beginning of my revenge. I started watching them the way a doctor studies a patient calmly, closely, looking for symptoms. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I needed proof. Proof that what had happened wasn't a mistake or a momentary weakness. Proof that it was deliberate. Proof that my life had been traded for their secret little comfort. They were careless, of course. People who believe they've won forget the small things that save the rest of us. Receipts, offhand messages, patterns. They smiled in public and whispered in private, convinced the world couldn't hear them. I watched their confidence grow, and I felt something cold and patient settle into my bones. Where anger flared, it burned out quickly. Where it mattered, I learned to be still. Emma became my quiet ally without knowing the full plan. She noticed things I couldn't say out loud, a call I wasn't supposed to get, a meeting I wasn't invited to, and she handed me tiny keys, copies of schedules, casual office memos, names. She thought she was helping a man hurt by love. She didn't know she was helping a man who was about to become dangerous in the only way that mattered to him, methodical. First, I mapped their routines. Katie met my father at the country club on Tuesdays. Lunches were Tuesdays and Thursdays. Late-night calls came after 11. Terrell preferred certain restaurants, certain jokes, certain wines. Katie used the same thread when she tried to hide messages. A short emoji or a misspelling I could now recognize. One kept lists. I wrote down times, phrases, locations, people who overlapped their lives. Each little data point sat on my desk like a loaded pebble. Then I began the slow, soft work of making them comfortable. I let the world see them as they wanted to be seen. If you want someone to fall, you don't shove them. You let them stand on a surface that looks solid but hides cracks. I made sure their appearances together were visible. A shared photo on a social page. A laugh caught by a mutual friend. A dinner where they didn't think to lock their phones. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or storm into rooms. I learned to smile when I needed to, and to vanish into the background when it served me. The nicest trick was how ordinary I let myself become. Outwardly, I returned to work, pretended to plan the wedding I knew was dead, joked with colleagues, tried not to flinch when Emma's eyes met mine. Inside, I was assembling a structure. I learned to wait. Revenge, I discovered, is more patient than hate. I needed leverage, and leverage is built from truths people try to bury. Katie liked luxury, and luxury left trails, bookings in her name, a private email for discreet receipts, a planner who thought they were protecting a secret but had left a paper trail. Terrell had things he assumed were private, a small investment account he bragged about to the wrong man at a golf game, a vague conversation with a lawyer about settling personal matters. These were not crimes. They were vulnerabilities. They were soft places where exposure would hurt more than a scream. I didn't want to destroy them physically. I wanted to dismantle the things they understood as power, reputation, respect, respectability. Terrell had taught me that the world listens to a man who looks like he has it all. Katie had taught the world to trust her smile. Both of those things could be taken away more slowly and more precisely than any shout ever could. So I started small. An anonymous tip to a columnist about a too-close father-daughter rumor that planted seeds of suspicion. Among our social circles, a carefully timed forwarded message to someone Terrell respected, suggesting that loyalty can be complicated. A discreet copy of an expense slip slipped into a business associate's hand, suggesting misuse of funds. None of it was illegal. None of it screamed betrayal in court. But each piece nudged the world's perception in tiny, irreversible ways. There were risks. I lost nights to thinking about consequences. If they suspected me, would they close ranks? If Emma found out, would she leave? If I pushed too hard, could I be the one who looked monstrous? But the betrayal had already painted my face as something else. I owed them nothing. More than that, the logic of it, the idea that they would be brought down by the things they prized, felt clean to me. No blood, no mess, only truths revealed. The most intoxicating part was seeing how quickly complacency bred carelessness. Terrell began to answer calls later and later, assuming no one would notice. Katie's messages grew flirty and casual, as if they were safe in the bank of secrecy they had built between them. Their arrogance became my scaffold. People who had once looked at me with pity now looked at them with curiosity. Is something going on? Some asked. It's just gossip. Others shrugged. Gossip is a slow poison. It tastes like nothing at first. Then in time it eats away structural supports. I had to be careful about Emma. I couldn't bring her into the full circle until I trusted that she wouldn't be the one to soften my edges. She had already given me so much. Her attention, her steady presence, the occasional cup of coffee, perfectly timed. Her loyalty felt like a bank I could draw upon. But I knew the rules of this game never expose your allies until absolutely necessary. When I finally told her small, careful half-truths, she offered a strength I hadn't expected. She didn't gasp and run. She asked questions. She suggested small, tactical moves. How to make a receipt look authentic. Which mutual friends would take a hint, where to place a message so it would be seen. Her office skills became our secret operations room. As the weeks passed, I watched their social circles shift. Invitations that had once been automatic for me were rescinded without explanation. Terrell smiled at my face while arranging lunches with people who used to be mine. Katie made a show of being perfect in front of Terrell's friends, playing the role of the devoted woman while slipping small knives into the fabric of my life. But those knives didn't cut as cleanly as she thought. They gathered about them, and I began to see the outline of exposure. One evening, I attended a charity event where Terrell was being praised for his generosity. He spoke about values, about family, about trust. I sat in the back and clapped with everyone else. Inside, I felt nothing but a slow, surgical coldness. I had placed a subtle hint-on offhand comment to a journalist about someone with conflicting loyalties, and as the reporter took notes, I watched the expression on Terrell's face change imperceptibly. He brushed it off in public, but later that night I watched him check his phone with a small, nervous movement. Fear, even a little fear, looked good on him. It humanized him in a way I had never wanted to see. They were falling into complacency. Yes, but more importantly, they were becoming human. That was the cruel twist. The same habits that made them feel invincible were the ones that would expose them. The more they believed in their secret, the less they guarded the ordinary things that would unravel them. By the time I closed Section 3 in my head, I had lists, receipts, screenshots, casual witness statements, patterns of behavior. I had built a quiet dossier of truths that, while not criminal, were damaging in the court of social judgment and business trust. I had also built patience. The plan was no longer an idea, it was method. I would not rush the fall. I wanted it to be inevitable. And as the final piece slid into place, I found myself smiling in a way I hadn't since this all began, but with the calm satisfaction of a man who finally had something he had been denied. I had waited long enough. Months of observation, planning, and collecting subtle truths had prepared me for this moment. The first strike wouldn't be dramatic. It wouldn't involve confrontation. No yelling, no shouting, no visible chaos. It would be quiet, almost invisible, yet devastating. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Terrell had arranged a weekend retreat with some high-profile associates. Katie was to accompany him. They were giddy, convinced of their untouchable status, laughing as they packed expensive clothes and gifts. Every movement, every smile, every careless gesture became my ammunition. I started with the smallest piece, an email. I forwarded a subtle tip about their weekend trip to one of Tyrell's business rivals, someone who had always resented him quietly. It wasn't malicious, just factual enough: the retreat, the guest list, and the fact that Tyrell had claimed it was for family time. That last line, innocent as it seemed, planted suspicion. Why would a father and fiancée need to be there alone, outside of the public eye? By the next morning, I could see it working. Subtle messages appeared on social media, curious friends asking questions, colleagues whispering at the office. Tyrell didn't notice yet, or perhaps he did but dismissed it as idle gossip. Katie, on the other hand, looked uneasy. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes when she checked her phone. That was enough. Fear, however small, is the seed of chaos. I didn't stop there. Using the connections I had built quietly through EMO, I arranged for an anonymous note to be delivered to Tyrell's associates, a hint about a conflict of interest he had conveniently overlooked. I phrased it carefully, leaving no trace of me. It was like tossing a pebble into a still pond and watching the ripples extend outward. The next day at work, I noticed Tyrell's first slip. He answered a question in a meeting a little too sharply, his usually confident tone shaken by the faint echo of suspicion. Katie, too, was off. She smiled less easily, joked less freely, always glancing over her shoulder. Their perfect world, built on lies and secrecy, had started to wobble. I could almost hear it cracking. It was intoxicating, but I had to remind myself to stay patient. Revenge is not a sprint. It is a series of carefully calculated steps. The first domino had fallen. My role now was to guide the next few, invisibly, until the entire line collapsed in a way that could not be ignored. Emma was invaluable during this phase. She helped me check my work, confirm patterns, and even suggest new angles I hadn't considered. She didn't know the full scope of my plan, but she understood that Tyrell and Katie had hurt someone dear, and that was enough. I trusted her with details, but never the full picture. Too much knowledge could compromise the subtlety of the operation. By the end of the week, the ripple effects were clear. A trusted associate had begun questioning Tyrell's judgment. A mutual friend confronted Katie about inconsistencies in her story, all without me being noticed. I watched from a distance, a silent puppeteer, smiling at the quiet destruction of the image they thought untouchable. It was satisfying, yes, but also sobering. Seeing someone fall even subtly brings clarity. Betrayal has consequences, and those consequences are best when earned by the actions of the betrayer. They had chosen each other over me. They had underestimated me. That mistake would define the next chapter of their lives. As I sat alone that night, reviewing the results, I realized something crucial. This was only the beginning. The first domino had fallen, but the chain reaction had just started. And once it fully ran its course, Tyrell and Katie would see, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through the undeniable truth of their own choices, that nothing escapes consequences. They always think the first crack will be obvious, a shouted accusation, a public collapse. They never plan for the slow, surgical reveal. They don't see how a string of small, undeniable truths can rearrange a life until the rearrangement is already done. The week after the retreat, things escalated in a way I had hoped for, but still found thrilling to watch. My anonymous hints morphed into questions. Questions became conversations. Conversations became investigations. Quiet ones at first, then louder as more people. It began at the office. A junior analyst, someone who barely knew Tyrell's name beyond the few charity dinners he led, forwarded a message to the wrong person, a message that referenced an expense line that didn't match Tyrell's public persona. The recipient was a journalist friend of mine from college who loved digging into stories that people preferred stayed buried. I had always been careful not to involve the press. But this single mistake that I knew would be made at some point was the perfect example. The journalist asked a few polite questions. He didn't scream. He didn't write a headline immediately. He did something worse for them. He started asking for documentation. Once a journalist asks for evidence, the game changes. Suddenly, people who had been comfortable assuming the best began to look for proof. A couple of board members at one of Terrell's businesses quietly requested an audit to reassure investors. An old friend who had once praised Terrell in public stopped answering his calls. Katie's connections, though social butterflies who had always performed loyalty for the right price, began to flutter in uncertain directions. The house of cards I had built in their minds was starting to wobble. Katie noticed first, not because she was cleverer than the rest, but because fear shows up early on the faces of the guilty. She called me that night, a quiet, trembling voice, pretending to be casual about a new dinner plan. "Andrew, can we talk tomorrow?" "I'm just stressed," she said, the word stressed thin as tissue paper. I gave the answer I had crafted months ago. I let her breathe. Let her assume I was still the same man she'd almost married. Let her think I didn't know. Let her think she could still steer me away if she played the right chords. While she scrambled in the storm I had begun to summon, I continued to place facts in front of people who mattered. The most pivotal moment wasn't public. It was a private meeting in a small conference room where Terrell's partners gathered to talk in hushed tones about reputation risk. I was not in the room. I never was. But I did something better. I sent a careful email to one of the partners, the one who had always disliked Terrell's arrogance, attaching a single, innocuous document that looked legitimate, an expense report with a note about personal client entertainment. The language was vague, but to someone primed by curiosity, it was enough. That evening, Terrell received a call. I watched from my window as he answered and went pale. The next day, a senior partner called a board meeting. The room was full of faces I had once respected, men and women who had asked for my advice at holiday dinners, who had once patted me on the shoulder at family events. They were now looking at Terrell with the measurement reserved for faulty investments. The public followed soon after. A popular social columnist published a piece not accusatory, but suggestive about the blurred lines between family ties and private indulgences among our city's elite. She quoted a few unnamed sources and described an unease among Terrell's associates. The article didn't name names, but in social situations, names spread like wildfire. The rumor mill did the rest. Whispers turned into texts. Texts into direct questions. People began to ask, is Terrell trustworthy? Is his judgment compromised? Katie's world, smaller but more immediate, began to implode. Her designer friends stopped calling. Invitations that used to arrive in perfect envelopes suddenly didn't. Her social proof, the network that kept her safe, frayed at the edges. She came to the office one morning with mascara on her face and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She avoided the elevator when she saw me, but it didn't matter. The rumor had already picked her out and was gnawing. The most brutal moment came when a mutual friend, someone I had known since grade school, someone who had always been kind to me, approached me with words that felt like sandpaper. "Andrew," she said, voice low, "I hate what's happening, but I have to ask. Is it true? Is Katie really?" I could have lied. I could have wrapped it in denial and let her keep the peace. But truth was my weapon now, and exposing the truth meant letting others see what I had seen. I told her simply what was factual and what I knew. I didn't embellish. I didn't gloat. I stated the quiet, cold facts that had already begun to tumble across my desk. Calls, meetings, receipts. Her face fell. She left quietly, and within a day the message had moved on. They responded, of course. Terrell tried to steady himself publicly, smiling for cameras, making statements about family and values. Katie posted a staged photo of herself at a charity event, captioning it with platitudes about love and forgiveness. But the carefully constructed responses looked small against the accumulation of small, inconvenient truths. Reputation, once punctured by evidence, does not neatly patch back together with words. What surprised me was how quickly their allies shifted. People who had held hands with them in private suddenly began to distance themselves in voluntary silence. Business calls went unanswered. A board member suggested that Terrell take a leave until matters are cleared. These were the real blows, not the gossip, but the erosion of trust in places where it mattered most. I felt something complicated as I watched them falter. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a hollow ache. Revenge had become real in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. It had consequences that reached beyond the two people who had hurt me. I kept reminding myself of the promise I had made. Expose the truth, let them face what they had chosen. Still, there were nights when the image of my father, not Terrell, the businessman, But the man who had taught me how to tie a tie and how to be polite to elders kept me awake. I was dismantling the image of my own father. There was no going back. Emma was with me through it, a quiet presence who handed me pieces of reassurance when I became uncertain. She'd sit down with a cup of tea and say things like, "You're doing the right thing," and I would want to believe it with my whole heart. She never asked to see the whole file I had on my father. She didn't need to. Her support was steady and practical, forwarding a contact here, quietly verifying a date there. She never judged. She only helped. As the public pressure intensified, small private fissures turned into heated arguments. I overheard them twice, once through a thin wall when Katie argued with Terrell about going public with their relationship. The other time when Terrell blamed her for the first wave of suspicion. The words they used were jagged, but revealing, stupid, reckless, exposed. Their defensiveness was a mirror to their guilt. The section of my plan I had feared most when the collateral began had arrived. Friends, acquaintances, even employees who had believed in Terrell's leadership were now asking hard questions. I had expected resistance, but I hadn't expected the moral complexity of watching people I cared about shift their loyalties. By the time Section 5 was ending in my head, the stage was set for the next act. The secrets were out, not in a single blazing headline, but in a steady, inignorable current that had started to pull at every seam of their lives. They were exposed, naked in the way that matters most, to the court of public opinion, to the scrutiny of business partners, to the tiny betrayals of friends who chose convenience over loyalty. I'd lit the match. The next section would be about the burn, how their world would falter when the pressure became unbearable, and how I would navigate what came after the exposure. But there was one thing I hadn't planned for. The look on my father's face when he realized that the man who had set all this in motion was his son. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. They always think there's a point where the noise will stop. They believe that with the right statement, the right smile, the right charity gala, things will slide back into place. But gossip isn't the only thing I had set in motion. People who run the city's institutions don't tolerate uncertainty. Once your name is a question mark on a ledger, your options narrow quickly. It started with small administrative moves that looked polite on the surface. A leave of absence suggested for Terrell to focus on personal matters. An internal review at one of his companies to reassure stakeholders.